In the early autumn of 2021, the Gifford Pinchot National Forest in Washington state was a sprawling tapestry of deep greens and fading golds, a place of breathtaking beauty that masked an unforgiving wilderness. It was here, in this vast expanse of ancient timber, that two sisters from Portland, Oregon, embarked on what was supposed to be a routine weekend escape. 27-year-old Nina Harlo and her 29-year-old sister, Rebecca Harlo, were not novices who had wandered unprepared into the wild. They were seasoned hikers who had grown up exploring the rugged trails of the Pacific Northwest, comfortable with the isolation and physical demands of the backcountry. They had informed their mother, Patricia Harlo, of a clear and sensible plan. They would be camping near the Lewis River Trail, a moderately trafficked route celebrated for its stunning waterfalls and dense evergreen canopy. The itinerary was set for return by Sunday evening, September 12th. But when the sun rose on Monday morning and the sisters failed to show up for their respective jobs, a quiet alarm began to ring. Nina, a punctual graphic designer, and Rebecca, a dedicated kindergarten teacher, were not the type to vanish without a word. By 10:00 a.m., Patricia was at the Skamania County Sheriff's Office, filing a missing persons report that would trigger one of the most baffling cases in the region's history. The timeline reconstructed by investigators painted a picture of eerie normalcy. On the cool, overcast morning of September 10th, a parking attendant at the Lewis River trailhead watched a silver Honda CR-V pull into the lot at approximately 8:30 a.m. The sisters exited the vehicle looking relaxed and well-equipped, donning high-quality hiking boots, rain jackets, and day packs. Their signatures in the visitor log at the information kiosk were steady, betraying no hesitation or fear. They noted their route, a 2-day loop connecting the lower Lewis River Trail to a series of quieter backcountry paths leading toward Bolt Creek. This area, known for its solitude and thick tree cover, was a perfect spot for experienced campers seeking peace. Critical to the investigation was the inventory of their gear. Patricia Harlo emphasized that her daughters were cautious. They carried extra food, a comprehensive first aid kit, and, most importantly, a satellite communication device. In the deep valleys of the Gifford Pinchot, where cell service is non-existent, this device was their lifeline. But as Deputy Lawrence Finch, a veteran of search and rescue operations, reviewed the case file, he noted a terrifying detail. The device had never been activated. No distress signal had been sent. This silence suggested two disturbing possibilities. Either the sisters had been incapacitated instantly, or something or someone had prevented them from calling for help. The search operation launched at first light on September 14th was massive. A coalition of forest rangers, volunteers, and K-9 units descended on the trailhead, while helicopters chopped through the air above. However, the searchers were immediately hampered by the terrain itself. The forest here is a fortress of Douglas fir, western hemlock, and red cedar, with a dense understory of ferns and vine maple that swallows light and sound. Aerial visibility was limited to the riverbanks and rocky outcroppings. Despite the difficulty, ground teams managed to locate the sisters' intended campsite near Bolt Creek by midday. The discovery offered more questions than answers. The clearing showed undeniable signs of recent human presence, a fire ring with charred wood and flattened earth where a tent had likely stood. But the site was sterile. There was no tent, no backpacks, and no wrappers. Forensic analysis of the fire ring deepened the mystery. The wood was charred but cold and damp, indicating no fire had been lit for days. The K-9 units briefly picked up a scent trail leading away from the clearing, but it vanished abruptly near a rocky slope, as if the women had simply evaporated into the mist. The forest had swallowed them whole, leaving behind only a parked car and a cold fire pit. The initial failure to locate Nina and Rebecca Harlo did not deter the search efforts. Rather, it spurred a frantic expansion of the operation. Over the next week, the search area was widened to encompass a sprawling grid of adjacent trails, dry creek beds, and overgrown logging roads that crisscross a landscape like scars. Divers were deployed into the frigid waters of the Lewis River, scouring the murky depths where the current was slow enough to allow for submersion, looking for anything that might suggest a tragic accident. But the water yielded nothing. On land, More than 200 volunteers combed through the undergrowth, shoulder to shoulder, calling out the sisters' names until their voices grew hoarse. They looked for discarded wrappers, lost clothing, or even a broken branch that did not look natural. But the forest remained obstinately silent, offering up no clues, no equipment, and no trace of the women who had walked into its depths. On September 21st, 11 days after the sisters were last seen, the inevitable heartbreak of logistics set in. The Skamania County Sheriff's Office issued a somber statement announcing that the active search was being officially scaled back. While the case remained open on Deputy Finch's desk, the deployment of large-scale search teams was no longer sustainable without new, actionable intelligence. For the Harlo family, this was a devastating blow, a signal that the authorities were beginning to view this as a recovery mission rather than a rescue. Weeks dragged into months, and the static nature of the evidence became a source of torment. The sisters' silver Honda CR-V remained parked at the trailhead, a haunting monument to their interrupted lives. Investigators had turned the vehicle inside out, finding only the mundane artifacts of a planned weekend trip. Spare clothes, personal items, a road map with the route highlighted in optimistic yellow, and a cooler filled with water that had long since melted. There was no sign of a struggle, no note, nothing to indicate why the car's owners had never returned to it. As the calendar turned from October to November, the character of the Gifford Pinchot National Forest underwent a sinister transformation. The welcoming canopy of early autumn gave way to the skeletal starkness of winter. The leaves flared golden red before rotting on the forest floor, and the temperatures began to plummet. The first dustings of snow capped the higher elevations, sealing off the backcountry. The Harlo family, refusing to accept the silence, organized their own weekend expeditions. Patricia Harlo became a fixture in the local media, reaching out to private investigators, and in her desperation, even consulting psychics. She maintained a social media page dedicated to finding her daughters, posting updates that screamed into the void of the internet, keeping the story alive while the world began to move on. By December 2021, a heavy blanket of snow had rendered most trails impassable. The search had gone literally cold. Temperatures regularly dropped well below freezing, turning the wilderness into a fortress that only the most elite winter mountaineers dared to breach. In the public eye, the tense changed. Friends began to speak of Nina and Rebecca in the past tense. Volunteers quietly stopped attending the planning meetings. The grim calculus of survival weighed heavily on everyone's minds. Hypothermia, starvation, exposure, and predation. The list of dangers was long and unforgiving. Despite the candlelight vigils held by Nina's co-workers in downtown Portland and the hopeful drawings made by Rebecca's kindergarten students, a dark consensus settled over the region. The unspoken belief was that the sisters had succumbed to the elements weeks ago, and that the forest would only give up their remains when the snow melted in the spring. But the wilderness holds secrets that defy logic. While the world assumed the sisters were dead, deep in the frozen heart of the forest, a nightmare was unfolding that no one could have predicted. The search had ended, but the story was far from over. The forest, however, had plans that defied all probability. On the morning of December 14th, 2021, the silence of the wilderness was broken not by a search party, but by the solitary crunch of boots on snow. Gordon Pace, a wildlife biologist, was deep in a remote sector of the Gifford Pinchot National Forest, conducting a routine survey of elk migration patterns. His work demanded he venture far off the beaten path, into areas of old-growth timber rarely touched by casual hikers. Equipped with GPS tracking gear and a camera with a telephoto lens, Pace was scanning the treeline roughly 4 miles northeast of the Lewis River Trail when a bizarre shape caught his eye. At a distance, amidst the towering trunks and the white expanse of snow, he saw what appeared to be 2 mannequins. They were standing perfectly upright against the base of massive Douglas fir, their bodies motionless, heads slumped forward onto their chests. The tableau was so surreal and out of place in the rugged terrain that Pace initially dismissed it as a morbid art installation or an elaborate prank left by summer campers. But as he drew closer, the horrifying reality resolved into focus. These were not mannequins. They were human. 2 women, their bodies wasted away to skeletal frames, were bound to the tree with thick industrial nylon rope. Their arms were wrenched behind them, wrapped around the rough bark of the trunk, and secured with terrifying tightness. Their legs were similarly lashed at the ankles and knees, effectively locking them into a standing position. They were dressed in what had once been high-quality hiking gear, now reduced to filthy, tattered rags that offered no protection against the biting cold. Their hair was a matted nest of dirt and pine needles, their skin pale and cracked from severe exposure. Pace froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pulled out his satellite phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed emergency services. According to the transcript, his voice shook, but his report was precise. He relayed the GPS coordinates and the impossible fact that the women appeared to be alive but unresponsive. Following the dispatcher's instructions, Pace approached the figures. He placed 2 fingers against the neck of the nearest woman, a pulse thready, irregular, and faint flutter beneath his touch. He checked the second woman and found the same weak sign of life. They were barely clinging to existence, suspended in a twilight state between life and death. The impossibility of the situation was overwhelming. These women had been missing for 3 months. It was mid-December. There was no shelter, no evidence of fire, and no food or water source nearby. Yet, somehow they were breathing. The response was swift. A rescue helicopter launched from the nearest ranger station, while a ground team began the arduous trek to Pace's coordinates. Within 90 minutes, the silence of the glade was shattered by the roar of rotors. When the first responders arrived, the scene silenced even the most veteran among them. Paramedic Jennifer Whitmore later described it in her official statement, noting that the sisters looked like they had been through a war. But the most haunting detail was their posture. Despite being unconscious, the ropes had held them upright, a cruel puppetry that had prevented them from collapsing even as their consciousness faded. The paramedics worked with surgical precision to cut the nylon bindings. As the tension was released, both women immediately collapsed into the arms of the rescuers, their bodies limp and devoid of muscle tone. They were secured onto stretchers and airlifted to Legacy Salmon Creek Medical Center in Vancouver, Washington, where a trauma team was waiting. The initial medical assessment was grim. Nina and Rebecca were suffering from severe hypothermia, their core body temperatures hovering just above the threshold for fatal cardiac arrest. They were profoundly dehydrated and malnourished, with estimates suggesting each had lost between 30 and 40 pounds. Their bodies had begun to catabolize their own muscle tissue for energy. But the most alarming evidence was the restraint injuries. Deep, infected ligature marks encircled their wrists, ankles, and torsos, proving they had been bound for weeks, perhaps months. Pressure sores on their feet and backs indicated they had been forced to stand for agonizing periods. Doctors were baffled. Biologically, they should have been dead weeks ago. Their survival was a medical anomaly, a testament to a resilience that science could barely explain. The sterile warmth of the intensive care unit at Legacy Salmon Creek Medical Center was a jarring contrast to the frozen hell Nina and Rebecca Harlo had just escaped. For days, the only sounds were the rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors and the hushed whispers of medical staff working around the clock to pull the sisters back from the brink. Their bodies were battlegrounds fighting infection, rewarming from deep hypothermia, and slowly relearning how to process fluids. The doctors were cautious. While their vital signs were stabilizing, the psychological trauma was a variable no machine could measure. On December 19th, 5 days after their rescue, the silence broke. Rebecca Harlo drifted out of her coma, her eyelids fluttering open to the harsh fluorescent lights of her room. Disoriented and terrified, she scanned the faces of the nurses hovering over her. As the fog of sedation lifted, panic seized her. Her heart rate spiked on the monitors, setting off a cascade of alarms. When she finally spoke, her voice was a dry, cracking whisper that chilled everyone present. "Where is he?" The question hung heavy in the air. Where is he? Not where am I or where's my sister, but a primal fear of a specific malevolent presence. The nurses tried to soothe her, explaining she was safe, but the damage was done. Those 3 words transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into a hunt for a predator. That he was real and he was still out there. Nina regained consciousness the following day. Her awakening was quieter, but no less heartbreaking. She stared at the ceiling for a long time, tears tracking silently into her matted hair, before asking for water. When told that Rebecca was alive in the next room, Nina simply closed her eyes and sobbed, a release of tension that had been building for 90 days. By December 21st, both sisters were deemed stable enough for a gentle interview. Deputy Finch, accompanied by Detective Laura Grimshaw, entered the room with a sense of dread. They needed answers, but they were terrified of what those answers might be. What they heard would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Sitting up in bed, her arms bandaged and her face gaunt, Rebecca began to recount the night of September 10th. She spoke in a hollow, distant voice. They had gone to sleep in their tent near Bolt Creek, feeling safe and secluded. Sometime after midnight, the sound of the zipper being slowly pulled down woke her. Before she could process the noise, a blinding beam of light flooded the small space. "Do not scream," a man's voice had commanded. It was not a shout. It was a calm, flat instruction. Blinded by the light, the sisters could not see his face, only a large, looming silhouette blocking the exit. In his hand, the beam caught the glint of a knife. He ordered them out of the tent. Terrified and confused, they complied. The man worked with terrifying efficiency, using plastic zip ties to bind their hands behind their backs. He did not threaten them with anger. He simply managed them like cargo. "Do not run. Do not scream. Do not look at me." He then forced them to march into the darkness. Rebecca estimated they walked for over an hour, stumbling over roots and rocks as the man followed closely behind, guiding them deeper into the untracked wilderness. When Nina had dared to ask what he wanted, he silenced her not with violence, but with a chilling indifference. His tone was devoid of rage or lust. It was the tone of a man doing a job he had done 1,000 times before. They were being led away from the world of the living, step by step, by a ghost who seemed to know every inch of the forest floor. The sisters' destination that first night was a nondescript clearing, miles from any trail, where the man had established a temporary base. It was here that the true nature of their nightmare began to take shape. He replaced the temporary zip ties with thick nylon rope, binding their ankles and knees, then looping the cord around their torsos to secure them to separate trees. He worked with a practiced, rhythmic efficiency, checking the knots for tightness but never for comfort. Over the next 90 days, a terrifying routine emerged. The man who Nina and Rebecca described as white, in his late 40s or early 50s, with a heavy beard and dead eyes, did not assault them the ways they had initially feared. He did not beat them in fits of rage. He did not touch them sexually. Instead, he subjected them to a regimen of calculated deprivation. He provided water from a canteen, sometimes a cup, sometimes just a few taunting sips. Food was scarce. A handful of dried fruit, a few crackers, or a single strip of jerky. It was never enough to satisfy the gnawing hunger that cramped their stomachs, but it was calculated precisely to keep them alive. Nina recalled a pivotal moment during the second week of their captivity. As the man tightened the ropes around her chafed wrists, she broke down, sobbing and begging to know why he was doing this. She asked what he wanted: money, revenge, anything. The man paused, looking at her with an expression of genuine, detached curiosity. His answer was quiet and shattered her remaining hope. "I just wanted to see how long you would last." In that moment, the sisters realized they were not hostages. They were lab rats. This was not a crime of passion, but an experiment. The man was studying their suffering. He watched them with the clinical gaze of a scientist observing an insect under a microscope. He never built a fire to keep them warm. He never allowed them to lie down comfortably. He forced them to stand or sit in awkward positions for hours, observing how their muscles trembled and failed. To avoid detection, he moved them constantly. Every few days, he would untie them, force them to march deeper into the treeline, and establish a new camp. He was a ghost in the woods, obsessively covering his tracks, brushing away footprints with a pine bough, stepping only on hard rocks, and navigating complex terrain without a map or GPS. He was always listening, Rebecca remembered hearing distant shouts of search parties and the thrum of a helicopter once. Each time, the man would gag them swiftly and stand perfectly still, blending into the foliage until potential rescuers moved on. He tormented them psychologically as well. He whispered to them that the search had been called off, that their family had moved on, that the world had forgotten the Harlo sisters. As winter set in and their bodies began to fail, hair falling out, skin breaking down into sores, minds clouded with delirium, his words began to feel like the truth. Finally, in early December, the pattern changed. Instead of setting up a new camp, he marched them to the massive Douglas fir, where they would eventually be found. He bound them tighter than ever before, wrapping the ropes around the trunk with a permanence that signaled the end. He stepped back, looked at his work one last time, and then simply walked away into the snow. He did not say goodbye. He did not kill them. He just left the experiment to run its final course, abandoning them to the freezing darkness. The testimonies of Nina and Rebecca Harlo transformed the investigation from a rescue mission into a high-stakes manhunt. Deputy Finch immediately assembled a multi-agency task force, bringing together detectives from the Skamania County Sheriff's Office, forensic specialists from the Washington State Patrol, and agents from the FBI's Violent Crimes Unit. The charges were severe, aggravated kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder. Because the crimes had occurred on federal land, the full weight of the United States government was now bearing down on the Gifford Pinchot National Forest. The first breakthrough came from the sisters themselves. Despite their trauma, both women provided remarkably consistent descriptions of their captor. A forensic artist worked with them separately to generate a composite sketch. The image that emerged was of a Caucasian male, aged 45 to 55, with a heavy build and a thick, dark beard streaked with gray. But it was the eyes that drew the most attention, deep-set and, as the artist rendered them, devoid of warmth. The sketch was blasted across the Pacific Northwest, appearing on nightly news broadcasts and social media feeds from Seattle to Portland. Tips flooded the hotline, most of them dead ends. However, one call stood out. Donald Keir, a retired forest ranger with decades of experience in the region, contacted the task force. He did not know the man's name, but he recognized the face. He described a survivalist type he had encountered several times over the years, a man who moved through the woods with an arrogance that suggested he owned them. Keir recalled that the man drove a beat-up Chevrolet Silverado, dark green or gray, and had once mentioned squatting in the backcountry near the Wind River drainage. Investigators immediately ran vehicle registration queries for the area, filtering for men with prior records of trespassing or poaching. Within 48 hours, the system spit out a match. Vincent Lell, a 52-year-old drifter with a sparse but telling criminal history. Lell's driver's license photo, taken 6 years prior, was a near-perfect match for the composite sketch. The same heavy brow, the same unkempt beard, the same hardened expression. A deep dive into Lell's background confirmed he was capable of the sophisticated evasion tactics the sisters had described. He was a veteran of the U.S. Army, having served in the early 1990s with a specialty in field reconnaissance. His service record was honorable, but marred by disciplinary actions for insubordination. He was a man who rejected authority and protocol. Since his discharge, he had worked sporadically in logging but had effectively dropped off the grid in 2015. No credit cards, no cell phone, no permanent address. Vincent Lell was a ghost. The search radius tightened around the town of Carson, Washington, near where Lell's truck was last registered. Deputies canvassed the rural community, showing his photo to locals. A gas station attendant vaguely remembered him buying supplies months ago. But on December 27th, the critical lead finally arrived. A rural postal worker named Amanda Briggs called the tip line. She reported seeing a man matching Lell's description just 3 days prior, on Christmas Eve. He had been walking along Forest Road 43, a desolate gravel track that wound deep into the snowy backcountry. He was carrying a massive backpack and had waved her off when she slowed down. Briggs was certain the man in the sketch was the man on the road. The ghost had been spotted. Armed with the postal worker's credible sighting, Deputy Finch mobilized a tactical response team. On the morning of December 28th, a convoy of cells from the sheriff's office, the Forest Service, and the FBI rolled silently up the snow-packed gravel of Forest Road 43. The conditions were brutal temperatures well below freezing and visibility choked by low-hanging gray clouds, but the fresh snow offered a critical advantage. It held tracks. Ground teams, led by tracking dogs and supported by a drone equipped with thermal imaging, fanned out from the point where Amanda Briggs had seen the suspect. It did not take long to find what they were looking for. A set of heavy boot prints veered off the road and disappeared into a dense thicket of old-growth timber. The team followed the trail for 3 grueling hours, moving slowly to avoid an ambush. The tracks terminated at a rocky overhang, naturally camouflaged by thick brush and the slope of the terrain. It was the perfect hideout for a man who did not want to be found. The campsite was empty, but it was still warm. A sleeping bag was laid out on a bed of pine needles, and a small fire pit showed signs of recent use. But it was the contents of a discarded backpack that turned the blood of the investigators cold. Inside, they found a trove of evidence that confirmed the sisters' darkest testimonies. There were maps of the forest with specific zones marked in pencil, survival gear, and, most damning of all, an older model digital camera. When a forensic tech powered on the device, the screen illuminated a gallery of horrors. The memory card was filled with photographs of Nina and Rebecca at various stages of their captivity. The images were not chaotic snapshots. They were clinical documentation. Each photo was time-stamped, creating a visual timeline of their deterioration. The first image was dated September 11th, the day after the abduction. The last was from December 9th. The photos showed the women bound, gaunt and filthy, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Lel had not just captured them. He had cataloged their suffering like a field researcher documenting a decaying specimen. Alongside the camera were several notebooks filled with tight, cramped handwriting. These were not diaries of a madman's ravings, but observational logs. Lel had recorded data points, daily temperatures, the sisters' estimated caloric intake, their physical responses to the cold, and the gradual breakdown of their psychological resistance. One entry noted matter-of-factly that Rebecca had stopped speaking, while another observed Nina's onset of delirium. There was no guilt, no gleeful sadism, just cold, hard data. Realizing Lel was likely nearby and could return at any moment, the team set a trap. They established a silent perimeter, blending into the darkness as night fell. The temperature plummeted, but the officers held their positions, watching the glowing screens of their thermal optics. At 3:00 a.m. on December 29th, the radio crackled with a whisper. A thermal camera had picked up a heat signature, a lone figure moving slowly through the trees half a mile east. A 6-man intercept team moved to cut him off. As they closed in, the figure sensed them. He dropped his pack and bolted, sprinting through the treacherous, snow-covered terrain with the agility of a mountain goat. But the deep snow slowed him down, and the officers had the advantage of numbers. Deputy Travis Morrow flanked the suspect, emerging from a stand of cedars to block his path. "Sheriff's office. Get on the ground," Morrow screamed, his weapon drawn. The man hesitated, his breath pluming in the spotlight of the tactical flashlights. For a second, he looked as if he might fight. Then, with a slow, almost bored resignation, he raised his hands and knelt in the snow. As officers swarmed him, cuffing his hands behind his back, they pulled back the hood of his parka. The beam of a flashlight revealed the face of Vincent Lel. He did not look frightened. He did not look angry. He looked up at them with the same empty, dead stare that had haunted Nina and Rebecca for 3 months. The monster of Gifford Pinchot had been caught. The interrogation of Vincent Lel began on the afternoon of December 29th, 2021, less than 12 hours after his capture. In a sterile, windowless room at the Skamania County Jail, Deputy Finch sat across from the man he had hunted for months. Beside him was FBI Special Agent Karen Durst, an expert in psychological profiling. Lel sat with his hands cuffed to the table, his demeanor unsettlingly calm. He had declined a lawyer, stating with a shrug that he had nothing to hide, a chilling assertion given the mountain of evidence against him. When Finch asked him to confirm the abduction, Lel did not hesitate. He spoke in a flat, monotone voice, describing the events of September 10th not as a crime, but as a logistical operation. He detailed how he had watched the sisters for hours, waiting for them to sleep, and how he had used a flashlight to disorient them because it was efficient. But the true horror emerged when Agent Durst pressed him on his motive. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you take them?" Lel tilted his head, looking at the agents as if they were slow students. "I wanted to see what would happen," he said. "Simply, I wanted to see how long they would last." He explained that he viewed himself not as a kidnapper, but as a researcher. He had grown bored with reading about human endurance in books and wanted to conduct his own field study. To him, Nina and Rebecca were not human beings with lives and families. They were variables in an equation. He had controlled their food, their exposure to cold, and their psychological stress levels, documenting the results in his notebooks with the detachment of a biologist observing bacteria in a petri dish. When asked if he felt remorse, he shook his head. He argued that suffering was a natural part of existence and that his actions were no different from nature itself. The most disturbing revelation came when Finch asked why he had abandoned them at the tree instead of killing them. Lel replied that by early December, the experiment had reached its natural conclusion. The sisters were shutting down, their bodies failing. The data was collected, he said. He had considered killing them to finish the study, but decided he was uninterested in the act of death itself, only the process of dying. So he tied them to the tree, assuming they would perish from exposure within a day or two while he made his escape. He admitted to being mildly surprised that they had survived. The trial in the spring of 2022 was a somber affair. The prosecution laid out the photographs, the notebooks, and the testimony of the survivors. Nina and Rebecca took the stand, forcing the jury to look into the eyes of the women who had endured 3 months of hell. Their testimony was devastating. They spoke of the cold, the hunger, and the terror, but also of the whispered words of love that had kept them alive when their bodies wanted to give up. The defense attempted to argue insanity, citing Lel's antisocial personality disorder. But the prosecution dismantled this easily, pointing to Lel's meticulous efforts to cover his tracks as proof that he knew exactly what he was doing was wrong. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Judge Thomas Langford did not mince words during sentencing. He described Lel's actions as a level of cruelty that defies human understanding and sentenced him to 6 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Vincent Lel was led away in shackles, his expression as blank as the day he was found. Today, the Gifford Pinchot National Forest has returned to its quiet, indifferent beauty. The tree where the sisters were found still stands, a silent witness to a nightmare that ended in a miracle. Nina and Rebecca Harlo continue their slow journey of recovery, carrying the scars of their ordeal but refusing to be defined by them. They survived the impossible because they had each other, and because, in the face of a monster who saw them as nothing more than data, they refused to let their humanity be extinguished.